Welcome back to the Sunday Briefing. We are very excited now to be joined by California Congressman Darrell Issa. And Congressman Issa, we are going to read together now a post from President Trump. It seems like a big deal. He says, to all airlines, pilots, drug dealers, and human traffickers, please consider the airspace above and surrounding Venezuela to be closed in its entirety. Thank you for your attention to this matter. What is going on in Venezuela?
Well, the president has brilliantly fought a war on drugs with virtually no collateral damage. And once again, he's giving notice that there'll be more action to stem the drugs flowing from this corrupt regime.
And there are various reports where in Caracas, the shelves in the grocery stores are bare. People are freaked out that civilian areas could be targeted. Is that something that people need to be worried about, civilian areas and some kind of a American military operation?
Peter, what America does best is to target what it intends to target with no real collateral damage. And I have high faith in our military. If that strike occurs, that they will be striking the sources of these drugs, some of which come to the U.S., some of which President Trump, quite frankly, is protecting Europeans from deadly drugs coming to their shores.
I want to change gears here to something we were just talking about with Governor Pat Morrisey. There's been a lot of talk this week about how the last president, Joe Biden, and his hurry to get out of Afghanistan brought people into this country who should not have been here. And we have gone through the archives. We've pinpointed the exact moment that President Biden might have realized that his policies could be a problem.
Yeah, I'm asking you a question because before. No, wait a minute. I'm asking you a question. Is that accurate, the best of your knowledge? What?
Do you think that people have an issue with pulling out of Afghanistan or just the way that things have happened?
I think they have an issue that people are likely to get hurt.
Seems like it.
Who was that masked man?
Yeah, well, the mystery man is here on set. That was 4 years ago. Are we just now realizing that the Biden-led exit from Afghanistan was a threat to U.S. Homeland Security, or has this been a problem all along and we just haven't noticed it as much because there hasn't been a high-profile terror attack in a big city?
Well, I think what you just said is exactly right, is that we're now focusing on that period 4 years ago in a way that we did. But if you remember, we weren't empowered at that time. I went to Afghanistan, met with the commanding generals there before the withdrawal and knew that the withdrawal was going to be chaotic if we didn't change something. But then I went to Doha, to Qatar, and I met with the commanding general there that was receiving those people right after the chaotic withdrawal. And you know what he told me? He was forced to take people who came in who had no ID, who simply said, "This is who I am," on a Post-it note. He then gave them what he called a paper passport, and they took off to Fort Dix. So there were tens of thousands of people in that first chaotic withdrawal who are here today, who are whoever they said they were. No biochecks, no anything. So do we have a problem here today that we're looking at one example, but it actually underlies a much bigger example? Don't worry about this guy. Worry about 10 or 20,000 that are still here who may not be who they say they are, who in fact were let in during that chaotic withdrawal.
And to your point, it's not just this guy. This week, we have another mugshot to put up on the screen. This is down in Texas. Mohammed Dawood Alakazay is accused of posting a video on TikTok threatening to bomb a building in Fort Worth. He came over as part of Operation Allies Welcome. This is a big part of the reason why President Trump now says, I will permanently pause migration from all third world countries to allow the U.S. system to fully recover. He goes on to say he wants to remove anyone who is not a net asset to the United States.
Nothing could be more what we want to hear on the Judiciary Committee and the Foreign Affairs Committee. We want to play catch-up. 10 million people were allowed to come over our borders. My district includes the border with Mexico. And I saw people from virtually every country coming over, knowing that the border was open, knowing that they would be let in under false claims for asylum. Yes, the normal 1.4 million a year who seek citizenship, that will continue. But we do have to deal with catch-up, and that catch-up is going to take several years. And if we don't do it, we're going to have more incidents like we just had, more Americans losing their lives, more of us living in fear because we don't know who is among us. We just know that some who wish us harm, like September 11th, are with us here today.
I know President Trump wants to get these people who might not be who they said they were from Afghanistan out of the country. Is it possible to do that? Or do we have to just wait until somebody pops up at a metro station with a revolver and starts attacking service members?
I think there's nothing more important than what we're doing, which is to find out those who are among us that we owe so much to, who simply want to settle here. Many Afghans would be in mortal fear if they had to go home. Many of them were with us for years, helping us. Many of them have testimonials by U.S. servicemen in support of what they did for us. Those need to stay. But there are those who simply aren't who they say they are. And by the way, the rest of that 10 million that came in during the Biden administration and the open borders, among them are other people, including spies from China and so on. President Trump is doing the right thing, which is I've never met a man who more believes in the guest worker program and more believes in legitimate immigration, but at the same time, he knows the system has to get caught up. We need more judges. We need to get this done quickly. The president using military reservists in order to catch up. He's doing what he can do. We in Congress have to support him. We've got to fund it, and we've got to allow our country to get caught up. Undoing 4 years of Joe Biden is a monumental task. It's easier to screw up and let 10 million in than it is to, in fact, figure out where those 10 million are and who's bad among them.
Man, it's a big headache for policymakers. Thank you very much for being here, Congressman Issa. Come back sometime.
Hey everyone, I'm Emily Campagno. Catch me and my co-hosts Harris Faulkner and Kaylee McEnany on Outnumbered every weekday at 12 p.m. Eastern, or set your DVR. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page for daily highlights.